Good afternoon, everyone. I see the attendees are slowly trickling into the webinar. We're certainly going to wait just a couple of minutes before we get going, just to give everybody a chance to join. Good afternoon from me already. I'm Jenny Taylor. I'm going to be moderating this session. It's a huge pleasure for us to be here. Thank you very much to the London Language Show for having us. Thank you to all the attendees that are slowly coming in for joining us. Those of you who have joined us on previous sessions may already be used to this, but please take to the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Let us know where you are. Do so in multiple languages. It's the London Language Show, after all. So please, we look forward to hearing from you in the chat, where you're joining from, what you're interested in. From London. Excellent. Thank you very much. Sarajevo. Great, they're all coming in there. Wow, Guatemala. That's a little more international than some of the previous sessions I've attended. Bal. From China as well. Fantastic. It's great to have an international audience that goes beyond the EU. Again, as more people are coming in, good afternoon to everyone. Got people joining from the UK, including Scotland and Northern Ireland. Hello again, that must be someone from a previous panel rejoining. Quite a few people from the UK, various parts. Good to see you all, or to, well, not see you. I'll get to that in a minute. This is a webinar format, as previous panels have also been. So unfortunately, we can't see you, but we can see your contributions in the chat. So please do feel free to interact with us and the other participants in the chat. For any questions you have that you would like us to tackle during this session, I would encourage you to use the Q&A function rather than the chat, because we might not see questions in the chat, whereas we will be keeping a close eye on the Q&A and will endeavour to answer any questions there. I see that the number of attendees is slowly stabilizing. So good afternoon once again. Welcome very much to this afternoon panel at the London Language Show on new technologies in interpreting a brave new digital world. I'm Jenny Taylor. I work in the English language unit at the Interpreting Service of the European Commission, DG SCIC, and I'm delighted to have three of my colleagues here with me this afternoon to discuss this interesting topic. We have my colleague also from the European Commission, Carlos Hoyos, from the Spanish language unit. We have Predrag Latinovic from the EU Court of Justice. He works in the Slovenian booth, and Claire Ferguson from the English booth at the European Parliament. I'm very pleased to have these colleagues here. Thank you for them for being here. Thank you to the audience for being here. Thank you to everyone working in the background, both from our institutions and from the London Language Show, to make it all work and to help us keep an eye on some of the questions. And I would suggest that before we delve into the subject, some of you who have been in previous panels may already be familiar with this as well. I'm going to launch a quick poll just to get an idea as to who's in the room with us today. Here you go, you should be able to see it. How many of you are interpreters, interpreting students, and language lovers? Now, unfortunately, we only have a single choice. I would assume that all interpreters and interpreting students are also language lovers by default, but I suppose language lovers here refers to neither interpreter nor interpreter student. I'm just going to assume that we all have a certain love of languages. Otherwise, we wouldn't really be here. I'm going to leave that poll open just for a little while. 70% of people have already cast their vote, 75, keep them coming. We've got a lot of interpreters so far. I'll be sharing the poll results with you in a minute. Majority of people here appear to be interpreters. We've got a few interpreting students and people who identify as language lovers. I'll give it a couple more seconds just to see if we've got any more answers coming in. That doesn't seem to be the case. So just for you all to see, these are the results. As I said, mainly interpreters, which is nice. To be discussing this among colleagues, interpreting students, for whom I'm sure this is also a highly relevant subject in view of their upcoming careers. And yes, language lovers, which I think should probably actually be at 100%. Okay, thank you very much for participating in the poll. I see a raised hand. Unfortunately, that is not something we're able to deal with on this panel. So again, any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. Any comments, pop them in the chat. And I'd like to begin this session on new technologies, a brave new digital world, with a brief round of sort of introductions, really. Maybe the three colleagues here on the panel could just tell us briefly where you're from, what institutions you work for, just to get the ball rolling. Perhaps we can start with Predrag, who's first on my screen.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I hope you can hear me all. My name's Predrag Latinovic. I'm from Slovenia and currently from Luxembourg. I work at the EU Court of Justice in the Slovenian booth. It's very nice to be here. Unfortunately, I can't see you all, but it's very good to be here.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the floor to Claire next.
Hello, everybody. My name's Claire Ferguson, and I work at the European Parliament in the English booth. And I worked as a freelance interpreter for 5 years or so, and I've been on staff at the Parliament for about 8 years now.
Thank you, Claire. And Carlos.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody from Brussels. My name is Carlos Hoyos, and very much like Jenny, I work at the European Commission, where I am the head of the interpretation language unit. I've been in Brussels for a long time, for around 22 years, always working as an interpreter. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here with all of you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'd suggest we'll get started with our topic. I think interpreters have always been, interested in new technologies, but of course, new technologies have taken on an entirely new dimension in the last 18 months due to the COVID pandemic, as we're all aware. And I'd like to start off by asking you, how the pandemic had an impact on interpreting, what needed to change, what were the provisions that had to be taken within our various institutions fairly quickly. And perhaps we'll go in reverse order and Carlos could kick off.
Thanks. Well, actually, as everybody who is probably in this webinar understands, interpretation is very much the business of having people together in a meeting room and then interpreting the proceedings, interpreting what those people say to one another during the negotiations or conversations. And that was, of course, pretty much impossible due to the pandemic, where everybody had to be apart, basically. So COVID had a huge impact in interpreting and a huge impact in what we do at the European institutions. Of course, as you understand, the European institutions have a clear commitment to citizens, have a clear commitment to taxpayers, and therefore the institutions could not simply stop in their tracks and not do anything simply because people couldn't get together. In the institution where you and I, Jenny, work, the European Commission, as for those of you here who don't know, the European Commission is actually the institution that proposes legislation to the legislators in the EU, to the Parliament and to the Council. So it was important for the European Commission to be able to go on making those proposals at a time where citizens were in dire need. Borders were closed. People couldn't travel, but people needed to see their families. People needed to go to hospitals. Decisions had to be made. Very important decisions had to be made. And therefore, we had to reinvent ourselves pretty much from one day to the next to keep on bringing interpretation to citizens and to the EU. What we did was to introduce an interpretation platform from among the platforms in the market. We chose one that was best suited to our purposes. It's a Lithuanian platform called Interactio, and we have been providing interpretation in a remote way via that interpretation platform. And that has allowed us to keep on business continuity of the institution, even at the bleakest moments of the strongest lockdowns during the pandemic.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, your and my experience, as you say, is fairly similar working with the Interactio platform. And I wonder what it was like at the European Parliament, who I believe have also been working on that platform. Maybe Claire can tell us about that.
Yeah, I think the Parliament was very similar to the Commission. The President of the Parliament made it clear from the beginning that, yes, this was a pandemic, but democracy cannot be brought to a standstill. Democracy had to continue. And as the only directly elected European institution, the Parliament had to continue its work. And so, yes, we also used the Interactio platform. And within, I think, a week of the first lockdown here in Brussels, the interpreters were back in the European Parliament. We were deemed essential workers. And we very quickly switched to one interpreter in the booth using Interactio, using the platform, as members stayed mainly in their member states at home. Very few were present in Brussels at that time. In order to continue the very important work of the Parliament. There were lots of important decisions to be taken with regards to the pandemic. For example, to be able to allow travel in the European Union, and rules that had to be decided on that, but also other very important legislative files like the European budget, for example, also had to be discussed during this time. This couldn't come to a halt just because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Claire. Maybe Predrag, you can tell us about what things were like at the Court of Justice at that time.
Thank you, Jenny. As Carlos and Claire said, we had more or less the same obligation as the other two institutions, especially being the Court of Justice. We all know that there's a maxim in law which says that justice delayed is justice denied, which means that the court could not stop working, even though there was this particular situation. There were traffic restrictions, travel restrictions, pardon. People couldn't travel to Luxembourg, but the procedures had to continue, because otherwise, we all know that even in the best of times, court procedures take quite some time, and we didn't want to have any additional delays, which would be unnecessary. The court was a bit of an outlier in terms of technical approach to this, because we didn't use any platforms. The approach taken, especially by our IT department, was that we need something which would ensure, in their opinion, the biggest stability and security of connection. This is why we opted for the approach of the so-called point-to-point video conferencing. So our clients needed to use the commonly used video conferencing systems, and we went for the system of so-called validated sites. So when a party wants to connect remotely to the court, they need to have their site validated. And this entails certain tests. So we established a system of several points of test: first technical test, then interpreting test, then the third level of testing just before the hearing to make sure that the connection is good. And that was, and a party which did not have a validated site could not appear before the court remotely. So every party that wanted to appear before the court remotely had to be validated. And that was the approach taken by the court.
That's interesting. That sounds almost a bit like a reverse hub situation, where it's not the interpreters that are, away from the meeting, but it's the meeting participants, but they have to be in a very specific site with a specific technical setup. I believe that the Parliament also had hubs, or did set up hubs for interpreters in other cities. Is that correct, Claire?
Yes, the Parliament set up a number of hubs, not at the very beginning, but very quickly it became clear that we couldn't provide all of the languages that our members and the European citizens wanted. So hubs were required in order to make sure that we could interpret to and from all 24 languages. And so in Ljubljana, I believe, in London, there's a hub. We also use Strasbourg. The European Parliament facilities in Strasbourg are being used as a hub, or a bridge, as we call it, so that we can make use of the facilities there when we're working in Brussels as well.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about some of the challenges that this new way of working brought with it for interpreters. I think, a couple of you have already mentioned some of them. Claire, you mentioned the idea of one per booth. Perhaps I can clarify that doesn't mean that there was only one interpreter ever, in the English booth. You'd still have 2 or 3 colleagues working in the same meeting, but they would not be able to be physically located in the same booth, but would rather be spread out across various booths. So that would, of course, be one of the setbacks and the impact that has on language coverage, as you also alluded to. What were some of the other challenges that you would say came with this new way of working? Maybe Carlos or Claire? Claire, go ahead.
I think the fact of being one per physical booth just means that communicating with colleagues becomes so much more difficult. In the past, it was usually frowned on to be staring at your phone the whole time, whereas now we tend to set up a different WhatsApp group for every meeting that we're participating in order to be able to communicate with your colleagues if you have to leave the booth for any reason, or to when it's time for the handover. And so that's an added distraction if you have to be looking at your phone during the meetings. It's not ideal, but it's the best way we've found to manage during COVID. I would say that's one of the main drawbacks of one per booth for me.
Yes, if I may come in, I think Claire has maybe mentioned what is the hardest part for interpreters is, whereas before we would work 2 or 3 per booth, and that really created team spirit and we could help one another out. This has become impossible now with COVID because we can only have 1 person per booth. So this has made teamwork much more difficult. Of course, from the perspective of the participants, as many of you who are here and are interpreters know, sometimes participants connecting remotely have problems with the equipment that they use, and then therefore the sound, the incoming sound from those peripherals to interpreters is not always the best. And interpreters need crystal clear sound in order to be able to do their job properly. And therefore, we have also struggled a little bit with a poor sound quality, sometimes incoming from some participants. We have in the European Commission, we have devoted a lot of time and effort to raising the awareness of participants as to the important, and meeting organizers as to the importance of having the right equipment, what that right equipment is. We have created a system whereby we will test meetings before they take place, a couple of days before they take place, in order to make sure that everybody has the right equipment. Of course, it is impossible to find 100% compliance. You will always have someone who doesn't have the right equipment, but of course they cannot be, we cannot tell them not to take participate in a meeting, because you cannot just simply stop someone from taking place in a meeting who has to be there. So sound has also been quite an important issue. We, unlike the parliament, we don't have hubs. We work from the physical facilities of the institutions. We use our meeting rooms and our booths, 1 per booth, true, but we have the same meeting rooms where we have always worked, and we have some cabled rooms. So now we will cable 2 rooms together, which will work as a single room, and that allows us to offer a wider language regime.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, expanding the language regime by cabling rooms is, of course, a good solution to offer more languages. It does come with the added complication already alluded to by Claire, that not only are you not in the same room or in the same booth as your booth mate, you're not even in the same room as some other members of your team. So it makes that communication, especially in large teams, all the more challenging, I think. Predrag, I'd like to think that in the system of sort of validated sites, you would have excellent technical conditions 100% of the time, and everyone always uses the right headsets and your sound is excellent. Is that the case, or what are some of your challenges you've experienced?
I would like to think that too, but unfortunately, no. Even though we have a completely different system, we face the same issues. Okay, one of the issues was this one person per booth, the cooperation between colleagues, which was much harder. But I would especially relate to what Carlos just said. We also had difficulties with sound, because even though we established the system of validating sites, even though we provided our clients with technical requirements as to what equipment needs to be used, what kind of microphone is acceptable, what kind of microphone is not acceptable, there's still a huge variety of technique in the world, and technical appliances and the microphones, etc., that you can never be sure that the conditions are very good. To that, we can also add differences in, let's say, internet quality, connection difficulties, bandwidth, etc., which all then conjures sometimes into a perfect storm, sometimes into minor difficulties. But yes, sound quality could be an issue, especially because we know that in our meeting rooms, we all have state-of-the-art equipment. The sound is usually very good, and it enables us to do a very good job. And having another, let's say, weaker or worse sound quality coming in, I like to compare that to listening to the radio. You're listening to the BBC, and there's studio quality of the person in the studio, and there's someone calling in from elsewhere in the world, and you can sense the difference in quality, and that is something that also affects your work when you're working as an interpreter.
Thank you very much. Yes, sound quality indeed. We've got a few questions coming in the Q&A. One of them, were the delegates always in their offices? I heard some of them were in their cars, on trains, etc. How do interpreters manage it? That really sort of ties in with what we've just been discussing about the meeting etiquette of meeting participants, and how, you know, sometimes you do get people with excellent internet connection, a good setup and quite clear sound in a nice quiet environment, and sometimes you get, you know, setups that really aren't, you know, are barely suited to a Zoom conversation, let alone a conference that's being interpreted remotely. It is important to stress that the kind of sound that is perhaps acceptable for a normal video conference without interpreting is not necessarily acceptable for being interpreted, because the sound that we need to receive as interpreters, and those of you who work as interpreters here will know this, does need to be of you know, the highest possible quality, because we need to hear the incoming sound over the sound of our own voices at all times, and that makes it all the more challenging. Okay, thank you everyone. I've got a few other questions here in the Q&A about how can you check all delegates in a meeting of 60 persons. I think that probably refers to something you were saying, Carlos, about carrying out checks beforehand.
Yes, it's a very good question, actually. We, for meetings where we have that big number of participants, it is always very hard. We normally try to test meetings where we have a smaller number of participants so that we can actually talk to everybody and tell them about the equipment. But of course, it is a big challenge and it is very time and resources consuming, as you can understand. I wanted to say something on the question that you were tackling before about the trains and the cars. This is a very good question. And especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we had people connecting from, you know, all sorts of places imaginable. And that was quite challenging. Cars and their gardens and the supermarket. Our awareness raising has concentrated very much on making people understand that there is more to hybrid meetings with interpretation than simply sitting in front of a camera and speaking. We make them understand your office is now the meeting room and you have certain responsibilities, because you need to guarantee that whereas before you would show up to a meeting room and everything was there for you, you need to guarantee a minimum standard of things. And we now give well, not now, since the pandemic, we have given the interpreters the possibility to stop interpreting at any time when the sound is not good enough to provide reliable interpretation. As our interpreters have that possibility to say, unfortunately, we cannot guarantee interpretation because the sound quality is not good enough. And we think that by saying that, by sending that message, people will little by little understand that you need to comply with some simple meeting etiquette elements that will make the experience so much better for everybody.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? Claire or Predrag? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that one of the advantages of this validation system that we had at the court was that we avoided people calling in from bedrooms or their home offices, etc. So the good aspect was that we actually required every single person to have a proper conference room with proper equipment. So this aspect was luckily avoided for the Court of Justice. But awareness raising, as Carlos said, was very important for us because other people outside of the interpretation do not understand the necessity of very good sound for an interpreter. And people actually thought, yes, I can hear everything. Okay, it's not as clear as it should be. I can hear you well. I can understand you well. So what is the issue here? And it was very much a part of this awareness raising campaign that we explained to people that it is not the same to listen to a person, because now when you're listening to me, you can hear every third word that I'm saying, and you can still get the idea of what I'm talking about. But doing what the interpreters should do, so listen, translate in their heads, speak in another language, and control their output, is a completely different affair. And that was a major part of our work to explain to clients why good sound quality is very important for us.
Yeah, I would just echo what's already been said. we had, there's a group of members of the parliament called the questors, and these are a group of 6 members who are responsible for deciding on the rules for other members of the parliament and how things should run for members. And quite early on, they actually issued some guidelines for the other members of parliament saying that you won't be interpreted if you don't have a video, for example, or if you're, originally they said on the move, which we realized very quickly had a bit of a loophole because people would pull over in their cars, but you still had the sound of the motorway behind them. So that had to be changed to in a car or in any kind of transport. And we have and so now we have a written document that we can refer to if we need to stop interpreting for any reason.
Can I say something else on this? I think it's interesting. For people to know, the European Commission has now a video coming up where we will show what different kinds of devices sound like. Because the problem we have realized is that people don't know how they sound. I know how you guys sound because I can hear you, but I don't know how you perceive me. And people don't know how poor sometimes their sound is. So we have this little video, it's a 3-minute video coming up in a few days of this is what you sound like when you use your laptop microphone, when you use your webcam microphone, or when you use an external microphone or a computer headset. And that I think is going to be an eye-opener because most people don't know how bad they sound. How would they know, of course? So, and this video, we hope, will provide an insight into that.
And another important message we've been trying to get across is that it's not just about, well, you need good sound for the interpreters. No, you need good sound for your message to get across. We're still web streaming our meetings. Citizens can tune in to certain committee meetings and listening to the proceedings. And it's about their message getting across, not just whether or not the interpreters like it. And that's something we're really trying to get across as well.
Thank you. We've, so talked about some of the challenges in terms of the sound we receive and the teamwork that's become more challenging. What would you say that you've noticed a difference working in these remote setups versus the traditional pre-pandemic sort of meetings in terms of fatigue? The term cognitive load often comes up in interpreter discussions. Would you say that that's something that you've experienced personally, that you've seen in your institutions, and what measures have perhaps been taken to try and mitigate that?
Should I say something about this? It really, I personally have experienced that, of course. It is more challenging as an interpreter to be able to do your job in these challenging conditions. Of course, it is more exhausting because sound is sometimes of poorer quality, and therefore you need to concentrate much more to be able to understand the message. So the effort is much bigger. The fact that you cannot communicate easily with your colleague is a challenge, and that is more tiring as well. Somebody was saying, yes, just on the Q&A, the fact that participants are not in the meeting room and that you cannot read their body language, not only what they say, but their body language, the way they react to one another, the way they react to what you say. Now you cannot see that. You will only see these little squares in the screen, and it is therefore much harder to really read the room, if I can say it that way. And of course, it is very tiring. The way we have tried to cope with this or to counteract this is by limiting the number of hours that interpreters are exposed to this kind of environment. So we have arranged new working conditions for interpreters to be able to do their job properly and in conditions that can guarantee reliable interpretation and their health.
I completely agree with Carlos. It just adds an additional layer of difficulty to the already difficult work. So on top of juggling with all the other things that an interpreter needs to juggle with, there is this additional layer of difficulty of remote sound, remote party calling in. And I think there was a question from Vera. Yes, we can see our clients, but we can see them as you can see us right now. So it is a face on the screen, and all the non-verbal communication is gone, basically. And but you can imagine that this happens everywhere because especially now in the pandemic, everything is gone online. And I can just echo my own son who was doing homeschooling on Zoom, and he said that for him it was much less interactive. And I quote, he said, "I can't give my 100% because it's just online. I'm staring at the screen." So I could just transfer that to interpreting. It is very difficult to do a very good job because the situation has become a bit more difficult. There is another layer. Yes, of course, if the sound is okay, if the image is okay, we can still do our job, but it can get more difficult than usual.
Yeah, I would just add there's also, for a number of years now, the institutions, I think all of them, certainly the Parliament, have been moving towards a paperless Parliament as well, or paper smart Parliament. So already we were working on screens for the documents, trying to find your way through often very long documents on your iPad or computer screen. Now you have another screen to see the delegates, also your screen so you can communicate with your colleagues. And there's often quite a lot going on top of often poorer sound than we would like.
Thank you all very much. I'm just going back to the Q&As here. There's a question from Catherine, which I thought was interesting. Was security an issue at all in terms of secure connections that could not be intercepted? I imagine confidentiality as well. Who would like to take that one?
That I can provide maybe an answer to this. Security and confidentiality have, of course, been a major factor when deciding the kind of platform that was going to be used. I can provide an example. The interpretation service of the European Commission also provides interpretation to other EU institutions, among them most notably the Council. The Council of the European Union, they were very concerned about going remote and about having information on the cloud. And that is why they decided to use a platform. It's not the same one that we use in the Commission. They use a different one, but that had the advantage, that platform had the advantage of allowing the Council to have the servers in their facilities, in the Council itself. So it was a closed circuit that allowed them to really control the information. Because of course, as you understand, there are very confidential items that are discussed that potentially have a huge impact on everything, on the economy, on security, etc. And confidentiality needs to be guaranteed at all times. And that was one of the main concerns indeed.
I can add here that at the core, this was actually one of the main objectives why we introduced this system of validating sites and the system of video conferences, because our IT experts thought and believed that this point-to-point communication is much more secure, and it can also get encrypted. So the connection is much more secure, and confidentiality and security are something that the court really puts a big emphasis on.
Would you like to come in, Claire, for Parliament? I suppose all of your discussions are public anyway, or that's
not all of them, but
not all of them.
Many of our discussions are very public. Our web streams are available, so that's less of a concern. But of course, there are some security concerns. Although I'm not really an expert on the technical side of how that's handled, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Thank you. We spent quite a lot of time so far talking about RSI in the COVID context. This panel is about digital technologies in general. Perhaps we can talk about other ways in which new technologies and digital tools can be of use perhaps to interpreters nowadays. I think, Claire, you've already mentioned the sort of paperless or paper smart environment. Are there any other kinds of examples that you might mention to do with this?
We have a project that started during COVID actually in the European Parliament, and it's entirely on a voluntary basis, but colleagues, if there are important dossiers going through the Parliament, colleagues take time to provide a 1 or 2 page summary, the main vocabulary of each legislative file. And now that's all available on our intranet that we use as interpreters. And so whatever committee you're working in, or whichever shadows negotiations you might be involved in, if you check, there might very well be a 1 page really good summary done by colleagues, and other colleagues translate it into whichever language, or do their own original summary in their language. And that's a really helpful tool that I think if we were working with paper wouldn't be so possible, but because it's all online, it's very easy to do and to access.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can maybe chip in. Like Claire said, we too are moving more and more to a paper smart commission. So we work with fewer hard copies of documents, and we have moved more to working off of a screen, as you know, Jenny, for documents as well. So that has been a big change. We have an upcoming project. It will take a little while that we call the digital toolbox for interpreters. This will be it will be a kind of portal, if you want, where our interpreters would be able to access all documents for their meeting. They would also be able to communicate with the members of an interpretation team in a specific meeting. They would be able to exchange live messages through the platform. The head of interpretation team would be able to provide messages to the team via that platform. So it would be a sort of portal for our interpreters, like a one-call port for all the things pertaining to your meetings and for a specific meeting as well. And something quite exciting, I think, for all of us is that we are now cooperating with the University of Leuven in a project that it's called Speech to Text. This project is a commission project, not only interpretation. Our IT department is also involved, and DG Connect. So a number of general directorates of the commission are involved in this project of Speech to Text that will provide language services to European small and medium enterprises. But one thing that is important and useful for interpreters is that this system could provide you with real-time assistance as you are interpreting. For example, it would show you glossaries, it would recognize important terms of the original, and it would offer you a translation from a glossary that you have created immediately on the screen, or it would write figures and numbers for you on the screen, or names of people on the screen. So it could be a help for the interpreters as well. So we are now, we're participating in that project, and it's quite interesting, and I have to say quite promising too.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, that does tie in with a question that I've just seen in the Q&A about the impact of AI, because what you're describing, the speech to text, that is a type of artificial intelligence which could act as a help, as a support for interpreters in the booth. Predrag, would you like to say anything on any of these topics?
Well, I could just say that at the court, it's also possible to work paperless completely. I do it personally all the time. I don't use paper just for taking notes, but other than that, I don't use paper. All the interpreters have court-issued laptops which are secure, enable connection to the court's documents. We also have in-house applications which enable us to get to the terminology, to the case files, to the research work done by our colleagues who are lawyers here at the court. So our in-house IT department is, especially in the last years, quite good, and we have a lot of in-house applications which enable us to do our work, especially because our work is a bit specific. We deal with individual cases, individual hearings, and there are two aspects. There's this general legal terminology, which does not change too much, but there are special circumstances of each individual case, which are really special. So all these applications that we have enable us to do our work much better. We also use instant messaging and all that in order to coordinate now, since we can be in the same booth. But as far as the AI is concerned, thank you very much. I didn't really see who wrote that, but there was an Italian project that was mentioned. I'll Google that as soon as we finish with this. It's very interesting. But so far, AI, I think it's still up to see, because the things that the AI can do now is the speech recognition. Then there's machine translation, but then there's also a question of output. But for the time being, the use of the AI, as Carlos explained it, is basically the use of the colleague in the booth. So usually before you had the colleague who could find terminology for you, if you couldn't find it, or someone who can write a number for you, and if that pops on the screen, it's so much better. But thank you very much for this AI input. I'll check that.
Yes, thank you very much, Claire.
If I may, not so much on the AI, but on ways in which technology is changing life for interpreters. I would say for student interpreters as well. When I was training number of years ago now, I think twice in the year, we had someone from the Commission or from the Parliament come and listen to us. Whereas what we have now are virtual classes, and we're able to have links with universities in Europe, but also around the world. I've done one with Beirut as well, where we can listen to and give speeches to interpreter classes and give feedback to students. And that means that you have a wider variety as a student. You can have more feedback and also train with different languages. So I was working with the University of Tallinn the other week. There was me, an Estonian colleague, obviously a German colleague and a French colleague, all providing speeches for students with various language combinations in that class. So I think that's also very helpful for student interpreters.
Yes, that's a really good point, Claire. Thank you very much. I think that, yeah, the experience of the accelerated deployment of RSI, I think we all knew it was there in the background coming sort of, pre-2020, but then this, so the pandemic obviously really accelerated developments in that area, but it has had a really positive impact on things like, yes, student outreach, as you were saying, but also bringing more participants into the meeting rooms, participants that wouldn't otherwise necessarily have been able to be there. And one of the things that's always quoted, of course, as being an advantage of hybrid or online meetings is the reduced travel and the environmental impact that will have. So, we've talked a lot about the negative impacts on the work and the health and the well-being of the interpreters, but there are, of course, some positive aspects to take into account as well. Carlos.
Yes, I wanted to actually mention this aspect that you just mentioned, because now I think, well, we will see now. It is true that the situation from the point of view of the pandemic is starting to get a bit complicated now, at least in Europe again. But it is now time to start thinking of the post-pandemic, right? So for the first year, we managed it in a crisis mode all the time. Now it is time to think of an exit strategy and the way forward for the post-pandemic. But we have realized that this new way of working in remote interpretation and with participants sometimes connecting remotely is not going to change. We're not going back to normal or to what we had before. Let's put it that way. We will be back to this new normal where there will always be a component of people connecting remotely. And I think, and this tallies very well with what you were saying, the digital ambitions and the greening ambitions of the European institutions need to be taken into account, because they will play an important factor into the kind of interpretation that we can provide if we want to, for example, cut back on travel, so that we don't have that many people, taking planes and traveling long distances for very short meetings, etc. Those greening and digitalization ambitions of the institutions, which tie in with the general policies of the EU, will play a decisive factor in the kind of work that we do in the next few years.
Yes, Predrag.
Yes, exactly. One of the good aspects of this pandemic was that a kind of a fast forward button was pressed. So everything that we thought will happen in 5 or 10 years time happened in 6 months time. And of course, there are many good things to that. There are things that facilitate or simplify our work. And these things should stay, of course.
Thank you very much. I'm just going back to the Q&A to see if there's any new questions that have come in. We've got about 15 minutes left. So to all participants, if you do have questions, now would be an excellent time to post them. We've got a question from Vera saying, how do you cope with meetings where the participants bring their papers in the meetings? Do interpreters always have links to the papers on the net? I suppose that related to what we were saying about accessing documents in a paper smart way. I see various colleagues sort of grinning and shaking their heads. I would say that meeting participants bringing their notes into the meeting has always been something, that's always been something that has happened, and interpreters don't necessarily always have access to them, although we do try our best. Would anyone like to come in, Predrag? Or yeah, Predrag first and then Claire.
Vera, I stand corrected. Not all of my work is paperless. Of course, there are lawyers coming to the court with their own speeches prepared on paper, and in that case, we copy the speeches and we distribute copies in the booth.
I would currently that people aren't coming so much into the meeting rooms and aren't using paper. Actually, in some ways it's helped because they're able to share their screens from home. So if they do have their presentations or their speeches, even full speeches, I've had screen sharing. So from that standpoint, it has actually helped to a certain extent.
Yeah, the same thing for the Commission. Actually, we now have more access to, we have access to more documents because delegates can share documents at the last minute to sending them via email, etc. So that has really helped. We insist very much that everybody sends the documents that they want to be discussed, that they send them in advance so that everybody has them and that interpreters can prepare for them. But of course, as we know, interpretation is very much the art of just listening to something that you've never listened to before and interpreting it. So most of the time we work without the safety network of a document, of course.
Thank you very much. There's a few more questions sort of coming back to the pandemic and RSI and the health implications. One question is, did the number of meetings diminish in the pandemic? This concerns more freelance interpreters. I'd say it concerns all of us. The number of meetings, I can say certainly for the Commission, did drop quite drastically, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Yes, this had an impact on, as you rightly said, freelance interpreters and their recruitment, but also the just sort of general raison d'etre and job satisfaction of interpreters on staff who weren't able to come into work anymore from one day to the next. I don't know what it was like at the court if the number of meetings suddenly dropped drastically, or at Parliament.
I don't think that the number of court hearings dropped significantly. It did reduce, but we did reduce our language system regime. So there were fewer booths because we don't have an infinite number of booths, and we had this rule, one person per booth. So we reduced our language regime. So if in a certain case there would be, let's say, 7 booths, here I have to stress that the court actually, as I said, works on a case-by-case basis. So our language regime is really tailor-made for every single hearing, which requires a lot of work on the part of our planning. But in that case, for instance, if we had a hearing which usually would have 7 languages, it had 3 or 4.
I would say that in the Parliament, demand for meetings certainly didn't drop. What dropped was the ability to service all of those meetings due to the fact that fewer meeting rooms could be used because interpreters were more spread out. Certainly since the summer, I would say, over autumn, the meetings have increased. Yes, we have limits on the number of hours we can do in a day, the number of hours we can do in a week, but it's definitely picking up again now. And actually, one thing that I've noticed during the pandemic is that the pattern of the week has changed. In the Parliament, members would usually travel from their constituencies on Monday mornings and travel back on Thursday afternoons or Friday mornings. Now, because everyone's connecting from home, instead of having the week very compressed into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it's been much more spread out. So whereas before on Mondays and Fridays, we would have administrative duties, language classes, online classes, we're now much, much more likely to have meetings, be interpreting in meetings on days that we wouldn't have been so much in the past.
Okay, thank you very much. Before moving on to Catherine's question, I see a comment from Vera that civil servants are still paid, and that is the difference. And of course, we're aware of that. That a drop in freelance recruitment, of course, has a financial impact on freelancers that is not equaled to what we experience as staff interpreters. There's no denying that at all. You're absolutely right, of course. On the question by Catherine next, this related to the health implications again of working more from screens. She asks, are there any projects to keep tabs on the impact of the increased amount of screen work and the impact it's having on interpreters' health? And are there any specific aids offered to interpreters to limit negative impact on eye health, for instance?
I mean, at the Parliament, all I can say is we do have an in-house medical service, and we're offered annual hearing and eye tests. but I don't think interpreters are more exposed to screens than other professions, I think.
If I may add on this, I think this is a very pertinent question. I think, and like Predrag was saying, the thing is, with the pandemic, everything accelerated by a year and a half without us actually having time to sort of prepare for this, and therefore we had to find that balance between keeping business continuity and operating in that crisis mode, so guaranteeing that we could do what we had to do to keep on going, and at the same time trying to protect people's health, and so that is why we adapted the working conditions, etc. But it is now, as the dust settles, it is time to sort of maybe look into these questions more calmly. And well, we too have an internal medical service at the Commission, and we are offered eye tests and hearing tests. But now I think the time has come to really maybe look at all these issues a bit more calmly. I know, for example, that the European Commission is going to outsource a big hearing study with a few university clinics to understand what the impact is of hearing of interpreting via platforms. And so we want to understand the depth of the phenomenon, the volume of people who are affected by it. Is it a problem? Is it not so much a problem? To what extent is it a problem? To what extent can we do something? So the time has come now to really calmly look at all these issues.
Thank you. Predrag?
I would just like to echo what has already been said. We at the court also were considering hearing tests, but unfortunately, as with all health issues, they do not surface immediately. So these are the things that will, if there are any negative consequences, they will be visible a couple of months or even years down the line. So, but we are keeping an eye on that, and we're also trying to accommodate or let's say adapt the workload of interpreters if they are affected in a certain way, or if they need to interpret at remote hearings, for instance. We do take that into consideration.
Thank you. Yes, I thought it was interesting that the question addressed specifically sort of eye health and screens, because I think, as Claire said, I'm not sure that I'd say we as interpreters are more exposed to screens than other professions, particularly now that everyone or the vast majority of people with office jobs have had to work from home and conduct all their meetings on screens. I would say that, in the discussions I've been following, the hearing health and health issues related to hearing have been much more prevalent, but it is an interesting factor to consider as well. But I think, yeah, any studies on screen exposure in the general population will apply equally to interpreters, whereas perhaps hearing is more of a specific niche issue that we as interpreters face. Okay, I've got another set of questions here coming back to the question of AI. One has to do with the security aspect of AI and how safe is it to use AI software, which will be storing data, particularly when it comes to sensitive and confidential documents, and also will relying on AI adversely affect interpreters' income? Perhaps even to exaggerate that question, will we be replaced by AI at any point? What would you say to either of those questions?
I would say that I don't think we will be replaced by AI anytime soon, because artificial intelligence is really not very intelligent after all. It is getting better, but it's not really intelligent as a human being is intelligent. So I think artificial intelligence will really enhance the way we work and will give us new possibilities that we are only starting to see now, and that will improve our work. And I honestly do not see artificial intelligence machines replacing human interpreters anytime soon, but that will certainly help. Regarding the question of confidentiality, I think this is a very pertinent question, of course, and the European institutions choose very carefully the kind of software that they work with and where data is stored. We are given very specific instructions as well as to the kind of documents that we can store on different services on the cloud or not, because we are very conscious of the fact that we need to protect information very carefully, and we could just not put it anywhere on any software that has servers, you know, we don't know where.
Thank you. Predrag?
Just to follow up on the security issue, the court has the same approach. So yes, before accepting any AI, we would make sure that this AI is secure and that there are no other privacy or security or confidentiality issues. As far as the AI in general is concerned, I agree with Carlos. I'm still cautiously optimistic because for the time being, I don't see any other way for AI doing the interpreting than via this machine translation, which already exists. And we know that machine translation in itself has some shortcomings still. And to that, we should add speech recognition and then output. And we would also, and there's several aspects here that we should take into account. First, will output be good? For example, are the delegates anywhere willing to listen to a synthetic voice than a voice of a live interpreter? That's one thing. And then input, for instance, one of the advantages, as Carlos said, AI is not really smart because one of the advantages of a human being is that you can recognize errors. And there are many things such as weird accents. So we're speaking English and we're not native English speakers. So you can get the point, Burchett, but they're terrible accents. And sometimes at the court, I had the case of an Italian lawyer who was speaking of decisions of the commission, and he said, in commission's decision, and I don't think how AI could recognize that. Or there was a Polish lawyer who said that the cart of justice has to do something in the cars of these proceedings. So the AI could, one day be available to do that, but at this point, I don't think so. Actually, it is true that we don't know what will happen. Things that even the experts in these fields couldn't foresee 10 or 15 years ago are happening now. So I don't think there's anyone that can foresee what will happen in the next 15 or 20 years. But I'm still, as I said in the beginning, cautiously optimistic because I don't think we're going anywhere for the time being.
In light of the very limited time that we have remaining, I know we have to finish on time. I can just echo what the previous two speakers have said. I don't see us being replaced anytime soon. Certainly use AI to assist us in our interpreting, but replacing us, we're not there yet.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to the anecdotes there, Predrag, I saw an automatically translated text the other day from another language welcoming, Margaret, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, which, I thought was quite nice. So as long as, AI, as we say, isn't as intelligent as humans and doesn't have context, I think we're safe for now. It is almost time to wrap up. There's a couple more questions that have come in. One on why the Commission and the Parliament decided to use Interactio as a service provider. I believe that's already been touched upon, but would you like to say more about that, Carlos, just briefly?
Yes, I think the reason why we chose Interactio was the fact that Interactio, first of all, was a European company, and therefore the servers of Interactio are in Europe, which is kind of a guarantee going back to the security thing. Also, the fact that Interactio was a pretty small and new company allowed us to really have an open conversation with them as to the kind of things that we needed, and they have really adapted to the kind of interpretation that institutions do. So we have really had a kind of influence on Interactio, and Interactio has delivered what we were expecting. So it has really been a great conversation with them, and we really have a product that is very much suited to our needs.
Thank you very much. I imagine the reply would be similar for the Parliament, Claire.
Yes, the only thing I would add is Interactio was small enough to adapt, but also big enough to accommodate all 24 languages that we needed. And it was that combination, I think, that was particularly important.
Okay, lovely. Thank you all very much. I don't see any other questions coming in that we haven't addressed yet, and it is just about time to wrap up. So before we do so, I'm just going to share because I did promise this in the beginning, a QR code, which should allow anyone who scans it to have access to various links that should connect you up to the interpreting services of the 3 institutions. So I'll leave that up for a moment, give you all the time to scan that if you want. And thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us from all corners of the world, you know, late in the day, late in the week on a Friday afternoon. It's been a huge pleasure to moderate this panel. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists, Carlos, Predrag, and Claire. And as I said before, to everyone at the London Language Show and from our institutions working hard in the background. I've had a lot of fun on this panel, and I hope it's been interesting and informative for the participants as well. I'm just going to come back so I can see everyone. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the London Language Show and a lovely weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much. A pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Bye. Thank you, Jenny, as well. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, it was great. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.